Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we will be talking about everything you need to know about gaps in corporate identity and IoT. We have with us Heather Vescent. She's a longtime participant in the identity community. And we're going to review quickly in slide number 2 what SSI Meetup is about. So as in previous presentations, to talk through about why we're here. So basically what we're trying to do here is to empower the global SSI communities, and this is open for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're someone sitting somewhere in the world who's interested in SSI or company or part of a community. This is really for you to reuse it. All this content is being shared with the Creative Commons by Share Alike license, which basically means it's open source. You can reuse it whatever way you want. You just need to give credit back, in this case to Heather and to SSI Meetup, and then you can reuse it. And this has been happening a lot over time, and there have been like long-term SSI professionals who have been reusing these presentations, and that has made us really happy at SSI Meetup, because that's basically the objective, and people have been using it for their own meetups and stuff like that. If you have any questions during the presentation, as always, please jump in. You can use the question tool, and I'll share those questions with Heather, or you can also ask at the end of this presentation. And yeah, and I think that's the full set as always that we have. And Heather, thank you so much for being with us today and for making time.
Thanks, Alex. I'm really excited. I'm a long time watched what you guys have been doing at SSI Meetup, and you've really had so many great webinars and speakers, and I'm really honored to share some of my research with you guys as well. So in case you don't know very much about who I am, I have a strategic intelligence consultancy where I like to find the answers to really hard questions like what's the future, what is a market gap. I like to talk about that. I like to describe that as finding out the answers to the dark matter of an industry. And I am a researcher as well. I also am the co-author of a couple books. One of my other areas of expertise, in addition to identity, is cybersecurity, and I co-wrote the Cyber Attack Survival Manual. It's really for consumers. And then about a year ago, I co-wrote the Comprehensive Guide to Self-Sovereign Identity, which was a layperson's introduction to this whole idea of decentralized identity. I'm also a filmmaker. I love to show visions of the future in present tense with video. And like Alex said, I've been a longtime participant of the identity community. I've been attending IIW since 2007. I worked on account linking as a feature in AOL back in 2001. And I'm active in the CCG and other identity communities. So the research I'm sharing today was funded by DHS Science and Technology Cybersecurity Division by Anil John. And Anil was very curious about understanding what was being developed in the private sector for digital identity. Now, digital identity is important to the government, and the government has a different set of requirements than private sector, and the government also has a lot of R&D funds they can use for startups to have other types of technology being built that is not necessarily being developed in and of itself from the private sector. In order to make the decisions about what to fund and what's missing from the private sector, they need to know what the market gaps are. And a market gap is something that is a need that consumers or users need, but for whatever reason, there's not the market incentive for private sector to develop it. Now, this is particularly important in digital identity because so much of digital identity is kind of like a horizontal technology where you might, like ideally you have standards and protocols that are shared across the industry so that it makes it easy to share data or identities. In reality, what's happened is a lot of digital identity technology and software is developed in a silo. So you might have digital identity technology used for internet authentication or for medical records or for banking, and they all kind of use different types of technology. So Anil was very curious about what were the gaps in the private sector, specifically in regards to non-person entity identity, and NPE. You'll hear me use the term NPE. we learned that NPE is a term that not a lot of people use. So we had to define it. You can download this report at this bit.ly link. It was funded by US government, so it's free to download there, and there's more detail there. I will be sharing highlights from it in this talk though. So what I see as the current state of where we are today in digital identity is that the problems we have today are the result of the solutions we created in the past. And we have a bunch of new technologies, particularly around decentralized identity, that create new opportunities to both solve old problems, to solve new problems, and to potentially create a whole new set of opportunities. One of the challenges around digital identity today is that we are going to need to onboard billions of new identities in the near future. And these identities are identities of humans, they're identities of companies or legal identities, which that's an NPE. IoT objects that are smart IoT objects. We need identity for tracking things, which could be along the supply chain or mail, and these would be dumb objects. And one that I kind of added as I've started, as I've been sharing this research, is the identity of robots. We also, within the current state, have an appetite for increasing and new regulations in this space. And so as we're developing and trying to understand where the technology can go, we also need to communicate and have dialogue with governments and policy so that the right regulations get created for the reasons that we need the regulation. So let's start out. What is a non-person entity identity? When we did our research, one of the things we realized is that NPE is not a term that many people use. And this is because when we looked at NPEs, they're really defined based on whether you're in the legal world or you're in the IoT world. And so what we did is first we defined a taxonomy for what an NPE is. So we found that an NPE is a company, which is a legal entity. It is a thing, which could be a smart or dumb IoT device. And there's a legacy definition of an NPE, which is a system. And this could be a piece of software or something that runs on a system or a network or a computer. Now, for the purposes of this research, we focused on the company and the IoT identity. We didn't look at the system NPE identity. Why is this important? Because we're going to have a lot of identities that we're going to need identity for today and in the near future. I just did kind of a quick calculation to try to understand how many identities we're going to have to be thinking about, or our systems are going to have to be thinking about in the near future. So I basically took 7.7 billion humans, and I assumed that and of those, today, we have 34 to 48% online, and each of those individuals have about 7 different identities. I guessed at 2 government and 5 online identities. This is probably a conservative number. So from the human identity, we have 18 to 26 billion identities. We can compare that to the number of users that Facebook and Google have. Over here in the legal identity, I did a similar type of calculation. We've got 900 million identities. Down here, the largest share is this idea of IoT devices, and this calculation really ranges anywhere from 25 to 75 billion IoT devices that have identity. And then when it comes to tracking and shipping, whether it's just for supply chain or for just you're buying something off Amazon, a conservative estimate that takes into consideration UPS and FedEx, they ship 35 million packages daily, which calculates to 9 billion yearly. And so that all adds up to 100 billion identities. And so when we think about the types of systems that we need to use these identities and consider these NPE identities, we need to be thinking about these things. And the majority of these identities are not human identity. They're maybe a quarter. So that's one of the reasons why we focused on looking at NPE identity. Oh, one of the things I mentioned is I don't have numbers for this, but as I've been sharing some of this research, one of the things that's come up is the question of robot identity. And that's something we're going to definitely need to add to this list as well. The robots could be manufacturing robots. They could include home care robots. They could include autonomous vehicles. This type of identity is also important for us to consider within the scope of this research. So how are NPEs given identities? In this example, this is an example of a legal identity. You've got a couple people in this example starting a company. They put together their corporate paperwork, submit it to a Secretary of State. I live in California, so when I started my corporation, I submitted the paperwork to the Secretary of State. This was a registry. The Secretary of State took my money, assigned me an identity, and then, only then, was I given identity, a legal identity. This legal identity is then used to create other identifiers that a business can use. These other registries can include DUNS, or you can get an LEI, a legal identity identifier from the Global LEI Foundation. You can use it for patents. And as businesses do business, they need to have these different types of identities. In the case of opening up a corporate bank account, if you want to open up a corporate bank account, you have to show your corporate identity information, and you have to also show individual identity information in order to prove that there's relationships for liability. I just touched on this a little bit, that NPE identity, whether it's a legal identity or an IoT object, requires human identity, because you need to know who owns it and who's liable, who's responsible for the item at a certain time or place, whether it's in the supply chain, whether it's do they have access to be able to make those transactions. Humans take actions for NPEs. If you have a business bank account, then a corporation has someone who's authorized to send money to people. And NPEs can take action for humans. And then you also have humans and NPEs collecting and sharing data, both sides. So here we have kind of a lot of things interrelating with each other. And some of the ways that they relate with each other are clear, and some of them are not. Government's particularly interested in NPE identity because governments give legal entities the identities. In the case of my business starting in California, it was the state of California that gave me my tax ID, which then I use for both local statewide jurisdiction and also national jurisdiction in the United States. This legal entity is important in many industries to prove that you know who is liable or who's responsible for KYC, AML, banking and finance. If you're doing global trade, to be able to prove who's the owner of a shipment that's going through customs, either leaving customs or coming into customs, that might have also financial escrow impacts. And then, as I showed with the numbers of non-human identities, the Internet of Things is growing, and we need to be concerned about growing attack surfaces that have to do with security of IoT objects, and also being able to trust the data that is coming off of the sensors that they're collecting data on. In the end, from a legal perspective, you need to know who's responsible when something goes wrong. And that responsibility always leads back to a human. So you can see how NPE is complex because those identities relate to each other, they interact with each other, and they depend on each other. The bulk of the report identified 11 market gaps. We broke these gaps up into 2 categories: corporate or legal NPE gaps, so that focused on legal identity, and IoT gaps, which focused on IoT object identity. And I'll go over some high level of these, and if you want to have more details, you can see those in the report. So the first one has to do with the legal identity of corporations. Oh, one other thing I want to mention before I kind of go into the details. There's several gaps. So the gaps we were looking to identify were ones that say like the market didn't have a solution to the problem. In a few of these cases, the market did actually have a solution, but they were either so expensive to buy or to implement that it was impractical to see those solutions addressed on a broad perspective. And those particular ones were, or there were market gaps where we think there's an opportunity to be better. Some of those examples were conclusive ultimate beneficial owner. I'll talk about that one momentarily. But when it comes down here to IoT security standards, self-authentication, and the data integrity, there are solutions to these gaps, but they're basically at the military grade level and very costly to implement. So I just want to put that caveat in there that while some of these are true market gaps, there's not a very good solution. There's not a solution or a very good solution. In some cases, there are solutions, but it's not yet accessible to the market broadly. Okay, let's go into the first one. It's pretty straightforward. It's the legal identity of a corporation. And the idea here is that we live in a digital world and we should have digital credentials. And currently, the way we do have legal identity of corporations is, the old school way. It's manual paperwork, faxing, takes time to do due diligence, to do research to find what is the identity of the corporation. And the work that British Columbia is doing with the Vaughan notebook, the Vaughan book, is a great proof of concept in where we'd like to see this moving more broadly. And this, the economic impact of not having digitally native credentials is extremely costly. And if you can imagine, like back to the whole web of corporate trusts, where if you are able to triangulate data from multiple sources and it's digital, then you can both speed up the efficiency of onboarding businesses, as well as have more confidence in the data that you're collecting. The next gap is a conclusive ultimate beneficial owner, and the key word here is conclusive. With KYC and AML, you have to comply with doing your best to try to find who the ultimate beneficial owner is, but in some cases, in some jurisdictions, you're just not able to find out that information. And so we think there is an opportunity, there's the gap to find out who really is the ultimate beneficial owner of a corporation. Now, one thing I want to say is this research, I'm showing this at SSI meetup, and I have a lot of background in decentralized identity technology, and I've looked at a lot of use cases in it. This research did not say we're going to go solve these problems with SSI. But if you read between where these are, I think a lot of us can see that many of these gaps can be addressed through using decentralized identifier technology, whether it's verifiable credentials or decentralized identity. So This research did not set out to find problems that SSI can solve, but I do think many of these gaps can be addressed by this new technology. All right, so the third one is conclusive verified corporation data. And again, the thing that we're talking about is like being able to know and trust the data about an object. And in the case, a lot of SSIs looked at doing it for individuals and for humans. And in that case, for humans, we have to be concerned about their PII. When we talk about corporation data, in some ways, you don't have to worry about corporate PII because that data is all public. This is also a similar situation to the second report we did, which is available on voter data. So I won't distract us with that right now, but if you're curious about that, that's another place where I think some of this technology could possibly be positively used. Conclusive verified corporation data is you want to know that you know their actual legal name and address and jurisdiction and who has access to do what. Again, like the previous gap, you have to do a lot of research, you have to triangulate data, you have to confirm that data. And in today's world, it's really easy to spin up a shell organization or start a company and just open up a bank account, and you could actually be a legit organization or you could not. And you could be doing a legitimate business or you could be trying to do something sketchy. And so again, to have conclusive verified corporation data is important from a liability, compliance, and who's responsible perspective if there is any illegal activities that might happen. The fourth gap has to do with corporate delegation. I mentioned humans, you have a corporate illegal identity, but humans do things for that company, and only certain humans have authorization to do those things. And so there's this desire to have real-time verified delegation. Can the person doing the thing on behalf of the company actually do it at this time? This leads into the fifth one, which has to do with real-time verified identity. So setting up that corporate delegation is pretty straightforward, and companies and banks are very good at doing that. But people change roles, and there's an increasing attack surface of hackers targeting CEOs for CEO fraud. Either spear phishing them or using new technology to impersonate them. And so this idea of real-time verified identity is similar to if you're going to log into a website and they send you two-factor code to your phone that you have to enter in to verify it is who you are at that time. It's a similar idea that you are real-time verifying that your agent of corporation has the authority to take the action on behalf of that entity at that moment, versus the way this is set up today, which is if you have a corporate bank account, depending on that bank's assessment of risk of your business, they will come to you and ask to make sure you have the most updated names on that account, anywhere from 30 days to 2 years. And CEO fraud is increasing, and it's extremely lucrative. In the research, we had the story of someone told us the story of CEO fraud where some fraudsters spearphished, I think it was a Dutch company, like a subsidiary of a French company, and basically were able to get $3 million for a project in Dubai that was not legitimately approved by the main company. So the last one that we've got with legal identity has to do with the responsibility. And this is a nested problem, because what if you have a company that owns factory robots doing things? Who's responsible when you have an NPE that owns an NPE, or a company that might own a fleet of autonomous vehicles? Or what if those NPEs are collecting data about either a human or other NPEs? What happens if these robots or autonomous vehicles are sold from one legal entity, one company A, to company B? We don't know. There's not a lot of prior art. There's a lot of discussions happening. There's going to be situations that are emerging, and of course, everyone loves to talk about the self-driving car. Who's it going to hit if there's someone in the middle of the road? So this ultimately comes down to who's responsible. Is the company responsible? Is the robot responsible? At what level of responsibility do these things have? So that's an opportunity for us to have fine-tuned understanding about that. Moving into the IoT identity aspects, one of the first things that we saw over here was there's no conclusive legal identity of IoT things. Like in getting your legal identity, anyone who wants to have a company has to go through the process of getting a legal corporate identity. But IoT devices, whether they're smart objects or not, don't have to have an identity. A lot of them do. GS1 has the GS1, blanking on the identifier. They have the barcode. So many consumer packaged goods already have barcodes or other identifiers on them. Also, a lot of companies they might have, depending on the device, might have a MAC address or a serial code or other types of things. But there's no rule that says an object or an item or a physical thing has to have a legal identity. So we don't have that. This is important. The identity of these objects is important when it comes to tracking and auditing items in the supply chain, whether they're just being moved from a factory to a retailer, or to track the data associated with the material as it transforms from a raw object, whether that's like a piece of cotton that's picked in India, to a t-shirt that is sold in New York City. One of the other problems associated with goods on the supply chain also has to do with tracking and identifying counterfeit goods. And this gap was particularly interesting, so much so that we ended up doing a deep dive into this area of research for our final report, which is tracking and auditing digital identity on the supply chain, which I just got approval to release publicly, and I will be releasing that in the coming months. That goes into a lot more depth into the opportunity and the challenges and the technology when you look at digital identity on the supply chain. And I will say that this is an extremely juicy opportunity with a lot of opportunity for growth, for new business models, and also to rethink our global economic systems. Gap number 9 has to do with security standards of IoT objects. This is one of the gaps that we were kind of hesitant to put it in there, because on paper, you do have the NIST standards, you do have some good guidelines, but when it comes down to actually following those guidelines and implementing them, it's not very good. Organizations, companies are not following high levels of security when they're developing IoT objects. And part of this is just due to try to get things to market quickly and cheaply. Unfortunately, many of these IoT devices that are not made with very good security and in the market, once they're out there, you can't take them back. So this is an attack surface that's potentially growing and will be difficult to contain or shrink. An aspect of IoT security that we wanted to look at separately had to do with the authentication of the IoT device. This is really important when you have IoT devices, many old IoT devices on a network that may be collecting data. And you need to know that the sensor or the IoT device, whether it is somewhere along a supply chain in a factory or whether it's on an oil pipeline, that you know that that sensor is where it says it is, and that you can trust that that sensor is there. And so there is technology along with trusted computing and hardware and chips that has been developed. But again, this technology exists. It's not broadly implemented to date. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to use trusted technology with more broadly as the cost comes down. The last gap that we found that has to do with, again, the IoT sensors, has to do with the data that those sensors are collecting. So not only do you need to know that the IoT device uses security standards, that the device is what it says it is, where it says it is, but that you can also trust the data that that sensor is collecting. And this is particularly important. There's an example of let's see if I can get it right. The Baku Tbilisi I've totally mispronounced this. The pipeline, there was a hack that happened a few years ago where there was an explosion on this pipeline. And because the attackers had taken over the IoT sensors, they were actually able to prevent the operators of watching the integrity of the pipeline that it had even occurred for 40 minutes. And this is in the spy movies, this is like you're breaking in and you're covering up or you're redirecting the security cameras. There were several other gaps that several other impacts that we found that impacted these 11 gaps in different and unique ways. That we didn't go into the details with each gap, but we wanted to mention them as being important and potentially impacting some of these things. As I mentioned, regulation. We are in a time where there's increasing interest and desire to have more regulation. And also the regulation that we've had to date has influenced the results of what we have. So, the compliance that we have with existing regulation, whether it's KYC or AML, I think that, that has created some of the solutions and the problems that we're dealing with today. So I think as we develop regulation for the future to solve some of these issues, we could possibly think about what is that impact of this regulation going to be, not just on the problems of today, but the problems in the future. One of the areas that I think could really use a lot more research has to do with the global landscape. Again, because of certain legal jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks, certain companies choose to have their legal businesses in certain jurisdictions. For example, in Northern Ireland versus in England, or maybe not having certain businesses in subsidiary businesses. You have corporations that choose the local jurisdiction to have their business in based on tax and legal frameworks, despite the fact that many of these problems have transnational and global needs. So particularly when you start looking at supply chain, you realize that regulations limited to a specific nationality have limited impact. And if you have 5 different nations with slightly different regulations and a supply chain that goes through them, you can start to imagine some of the complexity that businesses have to go through. So I think looking at the global landscape to really understand both how it has created the world that we're in today, and then as we do regulation moving forward in the future, how can we simplify the regulation so that companies actually, it makes sense for them from both an economic and business perspective to comply with broader regulation.
Heather, just one little question here from Oliver, which just fits well with this. He's asking, do you think that decentralized identity can also help in reducing friction in identity federation between companies and legal entities?
Yes, I do. And that goes back to, so actually, Alex, this goes back to something that we were talking about before we started. I did this, one of my early talks on identity was entitled How We Create Identity. And if you're a corporation, you have pieces of your identity, and even if you're a human, you have pieces of your identity that is, collected and created from a bunch of different entities. And so if these fragments of your identity that live in, like different systems can easily be shared with each other, then you create a composite identity, a composite corporate identity that you can then present to a potentially new business partner or a supplier. And it increases the trust because it could potentially reduce individual KYC due diligence. Now, one of the things when I was talking one of the earlier gaps, which one was it? It was like, it was kind of like a combination of like gap 1, which is the legal identity of corporation, the conclusive beneficial owner, and verified corporation data. We talked to people who had this idea of like a federated KYC, right? Like it could be like shared KYC. Now, from a legal compliance perspective, I'm skeptical that that could actually really happen because banks I've talked to like the idea of understanding and getting access to other banks' KYC data, but for legal liability purposes, they have to go through their own process to trust all of that. If there was kind of like this consortium of KYC, or there was a way for businesses to share conclusively verified data, yes, that would decrease friction, it would decrease costs, and could speed efficiency. Did that address that question?
I think so. If not, Oliver will keep on. Let me, he's just saying something. Yes, so he's happy.
Great. Yeah, so I'll just touch on scale. I already showed you the slide that had the 100 billion identities. And so and actually that slide was inspired by realizing the scale of the IoT devices. And I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg here. We need to really shift our way of thinking about identity from not just human identity to like billions and trillions of identities in the near future. And one of the things that was really kind of interesting too is this idea of formal ownership. I'm just going to touch on it a little bit, but in the case of registering your company, by registering it, or you register your car, or you have land registry, this type of transparent registry makes ownership clear, transparent, and then if you want to shift the ownership of that asset, you have a structure to do that. I wanted to share a kind of couple little ideas about the future that I'm thinking about that I'd love to have us address these as we develop next generation identity technology. We are no longer, we are all creating collective identities. We have these augmented, I think we have these augmented identities. I have my mobile phone that is an extension of myself in the digital world. I have software that might take action on my behalf, like I might set up a bill pay. I might have a device that turns my light bulbs on when I drive up my driveway. I have a weather station that's collecting data and sharing it with me or maybe other people, depending on certain parameters. These are all, in some aspects, extensions of my identity or my house or my life. And we don't really have systems or even a paradigm of thinking about that today that considers all of that. We still have a very human-centric identity. We don't think about these systems as much that we need to consider my identity when I've got a device doing something for me. So I would like to see us develop a more nuanced identity that can take into consideration that it's not just a human taking doing, I'm taking some action with my hand. My device might be taking some action for me. And what does that mean from the liability, responsibility, ownership perspective, especially from a regulatory perspective? And then also there's this idea of this combined identity that could be a lighter version of creating a legal identity. Like if people today want to create a collective identity, you generally create a company with people who are responsible to do various things. But I see there's opportunities to create a more lightweight version of this that could be more than the sum of its parts, that you might want to delegate or give access to different people to do different things. You actually might want to include this for NPEs as well. This might be a way to have more nuanced legal ownership or liability or something like that. So I think we need to start thinking about these types of scenarios so we can develop technology that can potentially address them. One of the things the existing identity technology is really bad at is delegation. And in previous research, it was very clear that basically if you want to share your account with someone, you basically have to let them pretend that they're you, because existing identity systems don't do delegation and very well, particularly when it comes to like if you're an adult child with you're an adult with a dependent adult, like a parent, or if you have children and they're going to school. And this is also really important when it comes to do with medical records and health and that kind of thing. So thinking about all of these different types of identities, whether they're human, whether they're a legal identity, whether they're like an IoT smart identity, a dumb object, a robot, and how they're all going to work together are things that we need to think about in new identity systems. I've kind of touched on a lot of these things already through the presentation. Why is this so important? We need to know who's responsible when something goes wrong, who pays when something happens. I've already pointed out that there's this global trend for increasing regulation. There's also a rising trend for organizations and governments to collaborate. In 20 plus years working in the tech industry, I've never seen governments so interested in having a dialogue and collaboration with private sector, and that's really exciting. And then as a futurist, I'm constantly looking and seeing what could be possible and could happen, and I wanted to help us envision the true scale of the problem. Some of my goals that I would have for you to use with future identity systems would be to manage 1 trillion identities and their relationships. That these systems should thrive in a dynamic environment, so they need to have resiliency built in. And some of this resiliency also needs to be from the cybersecurity perspective, but also in this dynamic environment as well. It needs to enable delegation between humans and NPEs and vice versa, and also between NPEs and NPEs. It should involve automated systems. And why not? Let's solve our current data and privacy problems. So I'm open for questions. If you'd like to download these reports, these are the 2 reports from this research that are publicly available today. The research I went over today was this Entities, Identities Registry. You can download that at this bit.ly report. If you're interested in the security of voter data systems, you can download this report. It looks at the security from that perspective. And Alex, if we've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
We have a couple of questions in the pipeline. I mean, this is more of a comment, but maybe you want to comment on that too. Timothy, he's saying, hell yes, this will reduce friction. I mean, it's related to the question before from Oliver. Yep. And he's saying, look how many documents need to be sent back and forth just to set up a bank account. This will transform the notary business someday. So maybe you want to comment on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. The challenge with all of this is that you know, we only put like 3 down here, but the challenge is getting everyone to work together and to use the same standards. And that's one of the reasons why DHS Science and Technology, the division that funded this research was dissolved, but there's still interest by people in government, a lot of folks in Canadian government and US government. One of the reasons why they're supporting the development of standards so much is so that it's easy for these organizations to adopt those standards. And the real power is when everyone uses it. I think what will happen is you'll have a critical mass at a certain point. There'll be a tipping point. I think we're still very, very early in the stage of that now. A lot of organizations are doing proof of concepts and testing things out. The DID spec just got, or the DID working group at the W3C just got approved as an official working group. So progress is happening, but it's slow. And if you guys are like me, we all want it to happen way faster than it is. But at the same time, there'll be a point when it will tip, and then it'll be downhill. Downhill would be easier for us to all create broader adoption of these things and change things. If you look at like the way adoption was of like websites back in the day, if anyone's that old, like I did a lot of technology evangelizing for Ajax technology back when it was called DHTML in 99, 2000. That really revolutionized and changed the functionality of the web. But it took years. And I think that's kind of, all of us are early adopters and early believers in this technology. And I think we're still very early. We have a lot of work to do. So yes, I agree with the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And a couple of more questions here. One more from Jose. He's saying, I work in the bank, and nowadays we are suffering an increase of CEO fraud. Banks would pay a lot to reduce the impact total or partially. Regarding the gap of live identification, what solutions should banks apply to resolve this huge problem? Two-factor authentication, biometrics, or anything else?
Yeah, so wait, this was which gap was this? The real-time verified identity?
It's the one where yeah, this one.
That one, okay. Oh, Jose, that's a great question. I mean, I'm sure you read that article about the voice spoofing. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd love to work with you to figure it out, though. I mean, yeah, biometrics could two-factor authentication. Um, this is an emerging attack surface, and it's very lucrative because you can you can like the fraudsters can get a lot more money from a corporation than an individual. So I don't have a good answer to that. Let me look at my report and see if we had other. What did we think here? Okay, so in the report for each of these gaps, we sometimes had a current solution or potential solution. So we said we see a possible solution using verifiable credentials issued to individuals by corporations that contain the rights they've been delegated. Yeah, I actually think this would be a really interesting gap to dig into to understand the aspects of the attack surface, and then to explore ways of mitigating them and reducing risk. Because you're right, like it's this, yeah, I don't know, I don't have a good answer for you, Jose, but I'm happy to help explore if you're interested.
All right, I'll Jose, just ping me, send an email to contact@ssimeetup.org, and I can connect you with Heather, or you saw her email before in the last slide, which maybe you can share again, Heather.
Yeah.
I have one more question coming here from Timothy. He's saying, one of the technology enablers for SSI is private key security in phones. Who's working on the private key problem for SSI?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. There are people working on it. I have to admit, I've kind of I've dropped the ball on following that area for about 9 months. It's about time for me to check back in on that. So I don't have a very good answer for you now, but I might in a couple months. I've been really focused on this research. But yeah, that's been one of the things that's on my short list to check back in about. There were some folks working on some really interesting things that I was following when I wrote the intro to SSI, but I'm not sure the status of that, so I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to point you in any particular direction.
Yeah. Timothy, I would just mention that maybe check out this one webinar with Drummond Reed about decentralized key management systems, where we did a webinar on, maybe, I don't know which number it is anymore, but just check that out. And there was also a tweet today from Christopher Allen, where he was using a different name. I think he was calling it self-sovereign identity keys or something like that. But if you check out Christopher Allen today, he wrote about this, and I think that is something that they were doing at Rebooting Web of Trust regarding the subject. And then there's also a white paper from a couple of years ago from Rebooting Web of Trust, which is called DPKI, Decentralized Private Key Management, and that's also accessible. So those are the three, at least from my side, the three latest sources I've seen regarding the subject.
Yeah. I agree though that the other thing, like Drummond's traditionally the go-to person. Drummond's work was inspired by the work of Greg Slepnick, who does some rebooting papers, and the rebooting paper that Alex mentioned is great. I just haven't checked in with what's happening in that in the last probably like 10 months. So I kind of have a feeling like there's some stuff rumbling, some potentially new conversations happening around that space, but I haven't dug into that research yet.
Yeah, I have. Jose, he's just saying that he just followed you on Twitter and that he will ping you over Twitter.
Sounds great.
And then I have one more question here from George, saying, because you were saying before, like, regulation is upcoming and increasing, but shouldn't we aim in this decentralized world and reducing regulation instead of having a bigger state?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think that, okay, so I started out years ago not being pro-regulation. Um, I actually helped co-write regulation in my local jurisdiction for Airbnb. And in going through that process, I changed my thinking about regulation from one of, I don't want any regulation, don't tell me what to do, to I see the value of regulation. I see the value of rules that can be enforced. Um, uh, I think I would say yes, we do need regulation because clearly the market cannot create its own rules and follow its own rules to not exploit vulnerable populations. And the GDPR law, uh, I would love if we didn't need it, but companies are under profit motive, and so they're going to optimize for profit. And this is something that came up in my supply chain research as well. When you have organizations and individuals optimizing for profit, people in the environment are getting exploited. And this is where you have capitalism eating itself. And so I would love there to be a world where we don't need regulation, but you're always going to have bad actors in a space. You're always going to have a tragedy of the commons, and unless you have rules that can be enforced, um, uh, there's you know you're going to have these bad actors, and so you basically need to have some rules and enforcement when a bad actor comes and does things that's not good for the whole. I've done a lot of thinking about the relationship between commons and capitalism. You can't have one without the other. Commons creates a raw material from which capitalism and entrepreneurship develops into products and services that compete in the marketplace. Once there's not a commons to develop, you can't have a profit-driven market economy. But the market economy has to also re-strengthen the commons so that we can keep this cycle going. This is one of my economic theories, and if you're interested in it, I've got a couple of rebooting papers. If you don't want regulation, I would say work to create a community or industry rules so that regulation is not needed. And I think that some of the work happening in standards organizations is addressing that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. I think we covered all the questions. Any final thoughts from you? Anything you would like to share where people can follow you or how to ping you? What's coming up next?
Yeah, so I just finished a year doing this research. It was 3 reports. These 2 are public. The supply chain one is coming out. I'm looking to work with some companies that want to build some real things. I've been following the standards work. I've been following what's happening in the space. And I'm really curious to shift from I've previously been working on focusing on supporting the development and knowledge and understanding of like the standards and the platforms. And now I would like to work with organizations to see how can you apply this to your business? How can it improve things? How can it really reduce costs, increase efficiency, provide a good ROI for a business while it's innovating new business models? So if you're curious in working with me on that, I'd love to talk with you. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. If you have additional questions about this research, feel free to reach out. This research was funded by the US government, and so it's publicly available. I want to just work to try to get this knowledge out so that we can all benefit from it, so that we can build better products. And thank you for
Wonderful.
coming to the webinar.
Thank you so much, you, Heather, for taking the time. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. We have one very short-term upcoming webinar, which will be this Friday with Drummond Reed. And he will be talking to us about the latest stuff coming up from the W3C DID working group that has just been created in Japan and that is getting together this week. There are plenty of people in Japan talking there together. So Drummond will give us an update about that on Friday, and same time as always. Check out the times. I'll be publishing it in the next 48 hours. So it will be a little bit short term, but you will be able to hear about the latest stuff. Next week, we have coming up Alan Krasowski from Kiva Protocol, who will be talking about the Kiva Protocol, how they implemented some of the really cool stuff in Sierra Leone to create virtual credit bureau and other things for the people there. So check that out too. We will have 3 box coming up in October and many other people in the pipeline. So as always, a lot of exciting stuff. And thank you everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you to you, Heather, for having been part of this community for so long and for sharing knowledge with everyone.
Thanks, it's really been my pleasure.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.